I never imagined that my own family could turn against me in such a way. After my father's death, I realized how the smiles of my mother, Helen, and my brother Luke hid ulterior motives. I, who had always been the less favored daughter, suddenly became the center of attention when I inherited the family estate and a modest fortune. The portraits on the walls seemed to warn me, yet I was blinded by the illusion of familial love. How naive I was. Now looking back, I clearly see the signs I ignored. Every affectionate gesture, every seemingly well-intentioned piece of advice, was part of a larger plan to manipulate me. During the family meeting, the atmosphere grew as heavy as a storm cloud charged with electricity. Helen, with her calculated smile, began suggesting the sale of the estate. Her words were like poisoned honey, dribbling false concern about our future. Every sentence she uttered was a hidden stab wrapped in affection. That moment, I realized, wasn't a conversation at all. It was a meticulously laid ambush. My heart, once shattered, began to harden. I would no longer be a puppet in a family theater of lies. Right then, I decided that I would control my destiny, no matter the cost. My mind became a labyrinth of doubts and fragmented emotions. Like a bird trapped in a crystal cage, I felt my thoughts battering against the invisible walls of familial manipulation. Helen's words echoed like venomous whispers, each syllable laced with a false sweetness that made me tremble inside. I recalled every moment in my life when I was pushed aside, the approving glances always reserved for Luke, the subtle comparisons that made me feel lesser. Now, in the wake of my father's inheritance, I realized that I had always been nothing more than a pawn in a game whose rules I never knew. Have I always been so naive? I asked myself, a bitter sarcasm welling up inside. Every memory of familial affection transformed into a transparent film, revealing the true intentions behind each gesture. The discussion about selling the estate was not a conversation, but a carefully prepared trap. My vulnerability began to give way to a controlled anger. I would no longer be the puppet manipulated by invisible emotional strings. Every breath became an act of defiance, every thought a strategy for defense. The pain transformed into fuel, my fragility into strength. The inconsistencies in Helen and Luke's speeches leapt out at me like flashlights in a dark night. I realized that my supposed weakness had always been my greatest strength. I was the only one who truly observed, who truly understood the family mechanisms hidden behind their masks. An ironic smile started to play on my lips. They thought they could control me, but I was about to completely rewrite the rules of the game. My father's inheritance would not be just a financial matter, it would be my personal liberation. That initial vulnerability gave way to unwavering determination. I would no longer be the submissive daughter, nor would I accept morsels of affection disguised as manipulation. My story would be written by my own hand, with the ink of courage and self-discovery. I then realized that my true inheritance was not in material goods, but in the strength I was discovering within myself, and that no one could ever take from me. My financial investigation began as a hesitant whisper, almost an apology to my own instinct for self-preservation. The family accounts, once a nebulous territory I avoided scrutinizing, transformed into the map of a silent betrayal. Every bank statement was a piece of a perverse puzzle. Suspicious transactions leapt out at me like open wounds, unaccounted transfers, withdrawals on strategic dates, financial movements that made no sense at all. Helen and Luke had constructed such an elaborate financial web that, at first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than accounting complexity. The emotional pressure grew like a suffocating shadow. My mother, the master of manipulation, began calling insistently, her tone alternating between feigned concern and subtle veiled threats. "Sweetheart, you needn't worry about these details," she would say, as if I were a child incapable of understanding numbers. But I was no longer that naive Emily. Every phone call was an attempt to destabilize me, every family gathering, an arena where I was simultaneously a gladiator and a prisoner. The financial discrepancies screamed louder than any of Helen's false reassurances. The lawyer I consulted confirmed my suspicions. There was a systematic pattern of asset stripping. Documents revealed a calculated strategy to gradually push me away from my father's inheritance. It was no longer a matter of feeling, but a concrete fact. My family was robbing me, inch by inch, dollar by dollar. My initial pain transformed into a surgical rage. I would no longer be a passive victim of a family theater of lies. I began meticulously documenting every piece of evidence, turning my vulnerability into an arsenal of irrefutable proof. Attempts to isolate me emotionally multiplied. Luke, my own brother, tried to convince me that I was being dramatic, that my discoveries were merely the product of an overactive imagination. Yet every word from him only confirmed his guilt further. The manipulation, once a mere whisper, now became a roar I was determined to silence. My resolve grew in proportion to my fear of them. I would no longer be the object of their schemes, but the architect of my own liberation. My father's inheritance would be mine, not by legal right alone, but as an act of personal resistance. And they, my mother and my brother, would learn that manipulating someone does not mean controlling them forever. The conference room had become a boxing ring disguised as a family setting. My heart pounded, convinced that this meeting would be the decisive moment. Helen and Luke looked at me with a mixture of feigned concern and calculated coldness that I knew all too well. "We need to talk about the inheritance," Helen began, her saccharine tone hiding razor-sharp claws. Every word she spoke was like a scalpel cutting away my past naivety. The same mother who used to lull me to sleep as a child now appeared as a cold strategist, ready to disappoint me. Luke settled into his chair, feigning disinterest, but his eyes betrayed him. I realized that this meeting was not a discussion. It was a verdict. They had a plan, and I was nothing more than a disposable piece. "Do you really think I'm going to stay silent?" I thought. My voice, once trembling, now rang out with firmness. "The documents I found show exactly what you've been plotting." The silence was deafening. Helen tried to smile, that fake smile which had deceived me so many times before. "Sweetheart, these are just misunderstandings," she said, but her nervous hands betrayed the obvious. Luke tried to interrupt, but something in my stare made him back off. I was no longer the submissive sister he knew. I had transformed into a woman determined to reclaim not just my inheritance, but my dignity. Every financial maneuver, every attempt to manipulate me, has been documented, I declared, throwing the bank statements and receipts onto the table that exposed the truth. My voice no longer wavered. It was like an axe severing the familial chains that had bound me. Helen turned pale. Luke tried to argue, but his words fell flat. I had transformed from the naive daughter to the relentless investigator. My pain had turned into strength, my sorrow into strategy. "You thought I'd always be the puppet," I said, my sarcasm cutting through the room. "But today I'm cutting the strings." The confrontation had only just begun, but one thing was clear. I would never be manipulated again. With growing determination, I continued my financial investigation as a hesitant whisper that had evolved into a clarion call. The family accounts, once a murky territory I avoided, now mapped out a silent betrayal. Every bank statement revealed a piece of a perverse puzzle. Suspicious transactions bled onto the pages like open wounds. Unaccounted transfers, strategic withdrawals, movements that made no sense at all. Helen and Luke had constructed a financial web so elaborate that at first glance, it appeared merely as accounting complexity. The emotional pressure grew like a suffocating shadow. My mother, the maestro of manipulation, began calling incessantly, her tone shifting between feigned concern and subtle veiled threats. "Sweetheart, you don't need to worry about these details," she said, as if I were an incapable child when it came to numbers. But I was no longer that naive Emily. Every call was an attempt to destabilize me, every family encounter an arena where I was both warrior and captive. The financial inconsistencies shouted louder than any of Helen's fabricated reassurances. The lawyer I consulted confirmed my suspicions. There was a systematic pattern of asset stripping. Documents revealed a calculated strategy to gradually push me away from my father's inheritance. It wasn't merely a feeling, it was a concrete fact. My family was robbing me, inch by inch, dollar by dollar. My initial pain had morphed into a precise, surgical anger. I would no longer be the passive victim in a family theater of lies. I began meticulously documenting every piece of evidence, turning my vulnerability into an arsenal of undeniable proof. The attempts to isolate me emotionally only multiplied. Luke, my own brother, tried to convince me that I was being dramatic, that my discoveries were products of an overactive imagination. Yet every word from him served as further proof of his guilt. The manipulation, once a mere whisper, had now become a roar that I was determined to silence. My resolve grew in direct proportion to my fear of them. I would no longer be the object of their schemes, but the master of my own liberation. My Father's inheritance would be mine, not simply by legal right, but as an act of personal defiance. And they, my mother and my brother, would learn that manipulating someone does not mean you control them forever. My journey of self-discovery was transforming into a battle for emotional survival. Every document, every record, every intercepted conversation was a step toward my true autonomy. The family that once suffocated me would soon witness my emergence as someone stronger, more determined, completely free. The family room had become a silent battleground where every word could spell my downfall or my liberation. Clutching a folder of documents like a shield, I fixed my gaze on Helen and Luke, who regarded me with a mix of disdain and fear. "I have all the evidence," I stated, my voice unnervingly calm. Bitter sarcasm danced in every syllable. "Every transaction, every financial maneuver you tried to hide." Helen attempted her usual saccharine tone. "Sweetheart, these are just misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" I interrupted, a cutting laugh escaping me. $1 million transfers to phantom accounts aren't misunderstandings. They're theft. Luke tried to intimidate me by stepping closer. I stepped back but did not lower my gaze. The fragility I once possessed had transformed into a crystalline strength, transparent as glass yet unbreakable as steel. The documents spread out on the table were like knives, each page a decisive blow against the family facade. Bank statements, emails, accounting records. Nothing would escape scrutiny this time. "You thought I was the naive daughter," I murmured almost to myself, "the one who would always settle for crumbs. Well, that's over." Helen turned pale. Luke attempted to argue, but his rehearsed words fell flat. I was no longer the Emily who accepted manipulation. I had been reborn from the ashes of a family that had tried to destroy me. Every second of that meeting was my redemption. It wasn't just about reclaiming my financial inheritance. It was about regaining my dignity and autonomy. "The game is over," I declared, my voice resonating like thunder throughout the room. "Now, you must account for your actions." That final meeting marked the definitive breaking point with my family. The immediate aftermath of that confrontation was like an emotional storm that swept away the facade of harmony we had maintained. Helen and Luke, who once epitomized a united family, now looked at me with a mixture of anger and despair. My determination had completely disarmed them. Every word I had spoken during that confrontation struck like a precise blow, dismantling the elaborate theater of manipulation they had built over the years. The decision to sever ties was not made lightly. It was the culmination of deep pain, years of neglect, and systematic attempts to diminish me. I realized that my strength did not lie in maintaining a toxic relationship, but in having the courage to break free from it. In the final moments, Luke tried to appeal to our fraternal bond. His words rang hollow, as if uttered in a desperate last resort. "We're family," he repeated, as if that phrase could erase years of manipulation. But family is not just a title. It's a commitment to mutual respect and genuine love, something they clearly never understood. Helen, for her part, wavered between anger and tearful manipulation. Her glances tried to make me feel guilty, but they no longer held power over me. Every attempt to make me feel remorse only confirmed just how toxic our relationship truly was. The inheritance they so fiercely contested was not merely financial. It was about power, control, and the pettiness of keeping me small so that they could feel larger. But in that moment, I realized that my true inheritance was my freedom, my autonomy, my capacity to rebuild myself. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Lawyers were hired, documents were sorted, and boundaries were established. Every unanswered phone call, every ignored message, was a step toward my healing. This break wasn't driven by anger alone. It was an act of self-love. The pain of familial betrayal would always be a part of me, but no longer as a burden that paralyzed me. I transformed it into fuel for my growth, a painful yet necessary lesson on the true meanings of family and respect. My journey revealed that sometimes, to protect ourselves, we must distance ourselves from those who should love us unconditionally. The freedom I earned was far more valuable than any material inheritance they could have offered. The silence that followed our break was deafening, but it was a silence of peace, of rebuilding, of a new beginning far from the shadows of family manipulation. Months after the family battle that set me free, I look back and see how pain can be a portal to transformation. The emotional scar that Helen and Luke tried to impose on me became my greatest strength. Rebuilding my life was not simple. Every decision felt like stepping on shards of broken family memories. I had to rebuild not only my financial legacy, but, more importantly, my self-esteem, which had been battered by years of silent manipulation. Investing in my career became more than a financial necessity. It was a declaration of independence. Every project completed felt like a punch in the face of the narrative of incapacity my family had constructed about me. I transformed my sorrow into fuel, my vulnerability into strategy. The remaining family ties were meticulously redefined. I was no longer the submissive daughter, but a woman who chose her relationships with the same precision with which she managed her investments. Helen and Luke became peripheral figures, optional presences in the story of my life. The toxicity of that family, once a paralyzing poison, is now nothing more than a distant memory. I learned that my true inheritance was not found in properties or bank accounts, but in the resilience I built by surviving that emotional storm. I learned that family is not an automatic right, but a privilege earned through mutual respect. And if a relationship no longer nourishes me, I have the absolute power to redefine it, or to walk away entirely. Today, I breathe freedom. A freedom built not on tears, but on determination. Every new dawn is a renewed opportunity to be exactly who I was always meant to be, whole, autonomous, and free. I learned that familial manipulation is a silent wound that corrodes from within. My story is not just about a financial inheritance, but about reclaiming my dignity. Every tear shed transformed into strength. I discovered that the true legacy lies not in material wealth, but in the courage to break free from invisible chains. Today, I am the master of my own destiny, transforming pain into personal power.